What is up, Algebra 2? Topic number 4 here for midterm reviews. We are talking about complex numbers. Now, remember, we have used some imaginary numbers. We got our imaginary numbers are our numbers with our I. We got our real numbers, which are all the numbers we know and love. And we have complex numbers. Complex numbers are a mixture of both real and imaginary, like so. This has a real part, 3, and an imaginary part, 2i. Together, they create a complex number. Two big facts you must know is 1, I is created when we take the square root of -1. The square root of -1 is I. Make sure you know this fact. Get it on your notes. Second, I squared. This is super important today when we start doing our operations. I squared is -1. If you ever have an I squared on your page, you're going to change it to a -1. Keep that in mind. Make sure everything that's starred is on your notes. And here we go. Question number 1 and 2. Let's talk about adding and subtracting complex numbers. Now, how do we tell if we're adding or subtracting? Well, the key is to always look in between your complex numbers. Here we have our first number, -5 plus 2i, and our second number, 4 minus I. These are two complex numbers. In between, we can see those that minus sign. So we are going to make sure we are subtracting. Just like terms, we are only ever allowed to add together like terms. We can add real numbers together, and we can add imaginary numbers. Never, ever can you add a real and an imaginary together. So let's go ahead and do it. My real numbers are -5 and 4. My imaginary numbers are +2i and -i. When you ever have a lone I, remember you can always put in your invisible one. This is a -1i. So we are subtracting, let's not forget. So we are going to make sure I take my real number, -5, and I subtract -4. -5 minus 4 is -9. With my imaginary numbers, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my 2i minus my -1i. -1i. This is exactly how I'd put it in my calculator. 2 minus -1 is 3i. Notice my I just stayed an I. It didn't become an I squared. When we add or subtract imaginary numbers, they stay I. So my final answer is going to be my real part, -9. And then my imaginary part, 3, which is positive, so plus 3i. And we are done. Let's do another one. Taking a look, I have my complex number plus my other complex number. I know that plus is my operation, so I'm going to make sure I add my numbers this time instead of subtracting. My real numbers are 6 and -3. My imaginary numbers, we got a -7i and a -9i. Look, see how I highlight what's in front? Here I highlighted +2i, -1i. Here I'm highlighting -7i and -9i. So let's go ahead and start combining our real numbers. 6 plus -3. Putting this in my calculator, I get +3. This is my real part. Now doing my imaginary, I have -7i plus -9i. When I add a -7i and a -9i together, I get -16i. And now that all that's left for me to do is to write my final answer. My real part, 3. And my imaginary part, minus or -16i. And we are all done. This is adding and subtracting. Here we were subtracting because I had a negative in between, so I made sure I subtracted my terms. Here I had addition. I was adding. So I made sure I added together my two terms. Okay, let's go on to multiplying complex numbers. Now, you'll notice in between my complex numbers, there's nothing. These parentheses are touching. So I know that I need to multiply. Okay, when we're multiplying two complex numbers, we're going to use the box method. So you're going to draw a nice big box on your paper. And we're going to divide this into a 2 by 2 box. 2 by 2. I'm going to take my first complex number, 3 minus I. 3 minus I. I'm going to do this in red. 3 and minus I. I'll put my imaginary 1 in. And my other complex number, I'll do this one in blue, -2 and positive 6I. Now, we're going to be multiplying. When we were adding and subtracting, we could only add and subtract like terms. When we multiply, we can multiply real and imaginary together. So let's do each box one at a time. So I have 3 times -2 is -6. Next, I have 3 times 6I. 3 times 6 is 18I. Make sure your I comes with. Bottom row, I have -1I times -2. Negative times a negative is +2. And bring the I with. Last box is the hardest box. Okay, this box is the trickiest one. And that's because I have -1I times another 6I. So let's first multiply my front numbers. -1 times 6 is -6. Now, when I multiply I and I together, I get I squared. Now, if you remember, I squared is -1. So we're going to rewrite this as -6 times -1. We're turning the I squared into a -1. And -6 times -1 becomes +6. So this is my number in my box. Now, just like we did before, to write our final answer, we're going to combine together. So we're going to add our real numbers, and we're going to add together our imaginary numbers. My real numbers, I have -6 plus 6, which is actually 0. My imaginary numbers, I have 2I, we're adding, plus 18I, which is 20I. My real part is 0, plus my imaginary part, 0 plus 20I. This is fine, but I could also just write 20I. And that is how we multiply complex numbers. Remember, there's nothing touching in between, so we know we're multiplying. And thanks, everyone. That is your 4th topic for the midterm. 3 to go. You got this. Tokar's out of here.